And today I have Dr. Shelley James, who is a lighting design consultant, and some call her the Light Lady. And welcome to the podcast, Dr. James.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, now let's just start at the beginning. How did you become a lighting design consultant? What's your backstory? How you ended up here?
So it's a long story. It's I started off living all around the world, and I was always really aware of the way that when I went from the tropics in Nigeria to the UK or into the States, everything seemed to change, and I realized that it was something to do with the qualities of the light and how that affected the way people
Mm.
behaved, skin colors, geography, geology, all the things around us, vegetation. So when I did my first degree in Paris, I did my first thesis on color in the environment and was fascinated by the way that we have choices about the colors that we wear, but it's very often mediated by that underlying climate dimension of light. And
Hmm.
I went on to work with brands all over the world, looking at color and pattern and shape and texture and how you can express an organization through those signals. And then I worked for big organizations like Visa International, Shell, all kinds of big people. And then I had a head injury, so I had to retrain my brain. I became extremely
Mm.
light sensitive, and that led to me retraining my brain to reprocess light signals correctly. At the beginning, it was just like water being poured into the hard drive of my computer. And then I set up a residence at the eye hospital, working with neurologists and scientists there. And then I went on to do a PhD in optics and perception, working with glass. I set
Oh,
up a light library so that people could play with. I trained as an electrician, so I could make work with light.
right.
I then created a light library. Then I started to do some amazing work with artists and performers on light. But the lockdown came in, COVID, and so I found
Hmm.
myself unable to do that work. So I set up a campaign about how light affects the brain because I knew it so well myself, and it went
Mm.
viral with kids. But they said we don't buy lights; grown-ups buy the lights. So I went on. I'd already trained as an electrician, but I'd also started to train as a lighting designer, and so I went on to become a member of the Well Advisory. I am an author now translated into Korean, which is amazing.
Oh,
TEDx speaker. So now I work with organizations all around the world, like a kind of a tour guide on how lighting can help their organizations to be healthier, happier, more sustainable. And so that's how I came to do what I do now, and I love it.
right. A wonderful winding path, and I'll refer to you as a fellow slashy.
What's that?
A slashy is when you're a lighting designer slash electrician slash
Okay.
fashion. Slashy is you have multiple hats, and I
Okay.
share your slashiness. So I appreciate, and I think there's a lot of creativity to be found in those hybrid spaces.
Agree.
It's interesting when you started off, you talked about traveling the world and noticing the climate and the light. And I my first overseas trip was to Los Angeles, around the world, and how much softer the light there is than in Australia. It's
Mm.
because of that Pacific haze, that marine layer. There's a softness there which I've not seen here. Um, and I also think of in many tropical countries, people will wear the vibrant colours. The really fire engine red and the saffron yellow and all the cobalt blues, which those of us in cooler climates tend to avoid. Is the lighting affecting people's wardrobe choices? I mean, obviously, in terms of warmth, yes, but in terms of colour, um, and I see that within Australia, that the further north you go, the brighter the colours are. And here in the far south in Melbourne, everyone wears black. It's Melbourne is notorious for everyone just wears black, head to toe, all day, every day. Um, what's your thoughts on the quality of the light and the color choices people make?
Well, absolutely, there is a clear link between those things. I mean, the
Mm.
first thing is that people's skin color tends to be different in those
Mm,
countries. And so they 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 look better. You and I,
mm.
when we put kind of bright green on, I mean, it's kind of okay, but it's kind of not. So there's a kind of an aesthetic choice. There's
Ah,
also a, if you think about the vegetation in those countries and the colors of flowers and those things, there's a kind of mimetic quality. So we tend
mm.
to, in a way, unconsciously blend in with our surroundings. So you'll see people wearing
Ah,
much more vibrant patterns and many more vibrant colors. And if you
ah.
stand them next to their local flora and fauna, you'll find some really cool interactions with that. The other thing is that the your eyes shift depending on they when you're born, it's like a completely empty field, or it's actually like an overgrown field, in fact, because there are many, many more neural connections in early childhood than there are later on, because it's as though as we walk through life, we wear little pathways, sort of default systems through this undergrowth. And so your brain evolves to respond to particular kinds of visual environments. And then those become your preferences, and you essentially sustain and perpetuate those. So there's a kind of a social mimicry going on as well, and a kind of neural patterning going on. And I
Yes.
suppose a final thought, and you mentioned about that haziness. So essentially, the colors that you see are linked to the colors that are coming out of the light source. So
Mm,
if you think about something being black, it absorbs light and it gets hot,
mm.
doesn't it? And something white, it
Yes.
bounces the light. So when you're in an environment with lots of with the full spectrum, but also particularly lots of those the into the infrared, into the ultraviolet, those very the edges of the spectrum,
Mm,
your the brighter colors look brighter in those environments. And we see that in nature. We see that insects with particular kinds of light sensing systems in their eyes are attracted to different colors of flowers, for example. So
yes.
there's a kind of physiological response to the difference in wavelengths coming out of the light source and the colors that we can see. So there's a all of those things together combine to create an overall kind of systemic preference for bright colors in environments where the lighting is very bright.
Right. Okay. That's and you do see it in fashion. And yes, if certainly my mother had Irish heritage, and I inherited a lot of her fair skin. And if I try to wear bright colours, it can be a bit of a challenge. So
Yeah. And we
yeah.
also sort of look a little bit out of place, don't we? We look as if we're pretending. So I mean, there's
Yes.
all of those things together. So there's a social, and then there's a
Mm,
physiological response. And I suppose the other part of that is that your brain evolves to, and we see that with children's eyes, if they live in environments which are visually impoverished, we see differences in the way that they respond to environments later on. So if you grow up with lots of bright edges and sharp shadows, you're going to be very comfortable having bright edges and sharp shadows or sharp contrasts on your clothing as well. So your brain begins to be wired to those kinds of patterns and then can adopt them on a body much more easily.
mm. And there's been what I think is a disturbing trend called beige moms, where it's always wealthy women who paint their houses beige. They wear cream and beige to nothing else. And I even saw one take her brightly coloured children's toy and paint it softer colours to reflect her home's aesthetic, which I thought, no, let children be, children and have their bright colours. Uh, any thoughts on the whole beige moms trend? Have you seen much of this where wealthy people are painting everything beige?
Um, I see a kind of a divergence actually. I see on the one hand a kind of interest in the kind of Frida Kahlo aesthetic, the kind of bright, the confidence of bright patterns. I was lucky enough to be
Mm.
hosted by Dulux, which is a paint brand
Oh,
in
yes, no Dulux.
yeah, I was lucky enough to be hosted by them at the Chelsea Flower Show. And the vibrance of colours and their advocacy for bright colours is one it's sort of it's one theme. I think the beige mom idea is sometimes a lack of confidence about choices of color because you
Mm,
can't go wrong with
can't
beige.
go wrong with beige and cream.
But the other theme there may be to do with a concern about neurodiversity, because we know that people who struggle with sensory processing issues have more difficulty sometimes processing bright colors or contrast because it essentially
Yeah.
triggers a stronger physiological response. So I recently did a project with the housing association and in collaboration with Dulux, in fact. And we had suggested a lobby. It's a kind of a youth centre. And so we suggested a really bright, vibrant lobby in kind of this gorgeous yellow colour.
Mm,
And the diversity team quite rightly came in and said, well, hang on a minute. If we have people coming in here who are concerned, who are anxious, who may be struggling with ADHD or in some way vulnerable, they may find this bright, wow, zingy lobby a bit overwhelming.
mm.
So what we ended up doing was to tone it down so that we have two walls zingy. I think it's one feature wall zingy, and then the other's calmer. So, and actually, what's happened is that that's created a sense of a spice without. It's the spice and rice idea that you have it's about sort of balancing the zing with the calm. So, my advice to the beige mums would be to embrace the beige, but also find ways to express some personality and to create something which is a bit more joyful.
Adding a little bit of color. And it's funny you mentioned Dulux and paint. I have an interesting story from a friend of mine who's having her house painted, and she contracted the painter, and the painter had, I have a question for you. She said, "What's that? You're not painting your house grey, are you?" And no, she wasn't. She was painting it a lovely teal color. It's a really lovely color because painting your battleship grey is all the rage here. I don't know if it's made it to your shores, but here I know I've seen a beautiful old Californian bungalow, over 100 years old, thereabouts, and they've painted it in two tones of battleship grey with a battleship grey fence in front. And that
Mm.
seems to be very fashionable here, and I think it's an extension of the whole beige moms things.
Yes, and I do think it expresses a lack of confidence. I mean, I think the world feels like a very uncertain place, and we see that
Mm,
in things like choices of car colors. Sometimes
mm,
there's a little phase where everybody's having red, and every so often you see a poppy yellow color. But there are these kind of trends for a particular color, and so I think it's an expression of a general insecurity and a sort of it's almost like a hunkering down color, isn't it? It's grey. It's sort of it's that. I mean, you mentioned
very,
battleship. It's a kind of
yes.
defensive move, isn't it?
It's defensive. Yeah, I think there's a lack of confidence and I don't want to upset the apple cart. I'll just do what everyone else is doing kind of thing. I don't think it's a particularly attractive colour to paint your house myself. You know,
What's
even
interesting
I
is
think
when we look
beige
at
might be better.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's a dark grey.
Hmm. I mean, what's interesting though is 2 points. One of them is that when IKEA first, but they call it the IKEA grey because when IKEA first started doing, well, you like to call it the IKEA grey because most greys under incandescent light, old-fashioned light bulbs, or even fluorescent light bulbs, looks pretty grim because
Yeah.
of the combination of the wavelengths coming out of the light bulb, which are generally in the warm end, and lots of infrared coming out
Yes.
of that with old-fashioned light bulbs, and now LED light bulbs, which have got lots of blue because that's the cheapest kind of light to generate using
Mm.
that technology. So it completely shifted the way that greys look in interior spaces. And so Dulux had to shifted
Oh,
the formulation of their greys to kind of look good under LED lighting. So it's had some unexpected consequences, this shift. And obviously outside it's a different thing, but I was just thinking about the interior space.
Oh, now that's something because the old incandescent lights with the tungsten filament, they were quite yellow, weren't they? Well, they are. I
They
mean, there's
were,
still whereas
yeah.
the LED lights have a bit more blue in them. Is
Yes,
that
so
correct?
that's exactly right. So if you think about an old-fashioned, I mean, I'm not sure how many of your listeners remember them. They got hot. Is essentially a wire, a copper wire
Hmm.
inside
Yeah,
a vacuum.
tungsten.
And so what was happening there was essentially you got like a little campfire in there, and that gave out a full spectrum of wavelengths like the sun, but balanced more towards the red, simply
Yeah.
because it wasn't as hot as the sun. The sun's much hotter, so it's
Yes.
giving out more of the blue. LED lights generate light in a completely different way. Essentially, what's happening
Mm.
is that there's a semiconductor chip. They were actually developed in the early computer days. It's basically
Oh,
you fire electrons across uh, a chip, a semiconducting chip, and semiconductor, the clue is in the name. It keeps some of it conducts some
yes.
of the electricity, and some of it gets fired off as photons. And
Oh,
those photons then are modified by a set of phosphors and other dyes to create the light, the photons that we see with our eyes. So it's a completely different, it's not a glow, it's essentially a pulse of individual photons that are coming out of the light source, which is why the cheapest kind of photon to create, because it hits the brain in a particular way, and because it's the cheapest in terms of the physics, is at the blue end of the spectrum.
oh,
So that is why cheaper LEDs, and particularly things like street lighting, are they not only do they not generate a wide range of wavelengths because nobody gets paid for doing more, but
yeah.
also because that's going to be your cheapest and most energy efficient way of generating light for the electricity you're putting in. Does that make sense?
So you have a mix of phosphors. And so, some will do red, some will do blue, some will do yellow. And so you don't have a continuous spectrum as such, you have sort of little pulses across oh, that gets messy. And of course, if it's a cheap one, well, you might just get two or three of those pulses.
I mean, generally they have what you'll see is a spectral power distribution, so a kind of a diagram which has a strong pulse in the blue, and then it'll be dipped in the greeny bits, and then you might see some more in the
Oh,
reds. So it's I mean a fluorescent tube. Now that really does have a spiky because each
oh,
of those the coating on the inside of that fluorescent tube, it generates light. The fluorescent is another technology. It generates
yes.
light essentially by creating an electric charge
Hmm.
inside the tube, inside a vacuum tube.
Yeah.
And that electric charge makes the phosphors on the inside of the tube gl glow, essentially. So,
Yeah.
as you said, each phosphor has its own particular wavelength, and your brain mashes them all up to create an illusion of white.
Hmm.
So that's a really spiky profile from a from a
Oh,
from a fluorescent tube, whereas from an LED, mostly they're engineered to give a reasonably smooth SPD, but there's usually a giant spike in the blue, and it very rarely goes well into the reds, and it certainly doesn't go off into the infrared or the ultraviolet, which are actually wavelengths that we know we need now.
right. Okay. So we've got this big spike of blue, and which is possibly the worst thing we could do for our circadian rhythm in terms of managing it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the right light at the right time is a great thing. So we know so the back of your eye, as I'm sure you've already explained in other episodes, but essentially the back of your eye has a light sensing membrane on it,
Hmm.
and it's a stack of different, there's the light sensing bits, the rods and the cones at the back, and then there's a stack of cells on top of that, a number of layers which kind of filter out the noise and consolidate those signals, then send them up through the top layer back to your brain, back to
Oh,
the visual
yes.
cortex. Now, the top layer of the retina, here's your eyeballs here, the top layer of the retina really is a relay station for all those signals. So it's responding to all bright light. But about 20 years ago, scientists spotted that even when they disabled the rods and the cones, about a 5% of that top layer was still chatting to the brain. In fact, it was
Oh,
particularly chatting to the middle bit of the brain. So it
oh,
sends a signal down through here to the structures which regulate attention and mood and sleep. So
oh.
they realized that that top layer, that 5% of that top layer had got an extra light sensing protein called melanopsin in it.
Mm,
And the sensitivity of melanopsin is around 480 nanometers. Surprise, surprise, it's sky, kind of around the
yes.
sky wavelengths. And so all bright light sends a signal to that, what we call the non-image forming system, although it
Mm,
turns out it does some other stuff too. So all bright light does it, but
yes.
actually when you add those blue wavelengths, it gives it an extra kick, like adding sort of sugar or caffeine to a drink. It gives it an extra boost. So if you're trying to manage your body clock, like you've
Mm,
just landed from
yes.
Korea or wherever, the main thing is to make sure your body clock gets that extra shot of caffeine at the right time and that it doesn't get any at the wrong time so that you can give your body clock a helping hand along with food, exercise, temperature, those other dimensions which tell your body what time of day it is.
Mm,
So blue light isn't a baddie, it's simply a baddie if you get it at the wrong time of day.
yes. It's a goodie if it's at the right time.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. So and we don't, with our lighting, it's use it more at night, obviously. So, and I do apologize. Yes, my lighting is terrible here. I'm about to have it all changed. And Dr. James has already critiqued my lighting. So in the next few weeks, my lighting will be changing. I promise you. So getting my studio set up.
Glad to
This
hear
was
it.
all an
Glad to
emergency during COVID. This setup. So
well,
this is kind of legacy.
but I'm a great believer in doing something rather than waiting for perfection. So I think it's great that you're
That's
doing this in whatever state you are.
that's exactly. It's ready, fire, aim.
That's the one.
So, um, and I believe you have a book.
I
Tell
do.
us about your book. Yes, please tell
I
us
mean, I've
about your
actually
book.
written I've actually written a couple, but this is the most recent one.
Oh,
And I'm actually in the process of writing another one. But essentially, so many people ask me about, I mean, I get the same questions a lot, which is wonderful. It's a privilege to answer them. But very often people say, where can I find out more? So I thought I would put all the questions people ask me into one place with a link to some online resources where all the academic papers are in case people want to really dive into that some more. So it begins with how the eye works, how the brain works, because you need to kind of understand a bit like learning how to drive a car. It's good to understand a
mm,
little bit about the gearbox so that you can actually drive it efficiently and safely. So, learning about the hardware, like the gearbox of the car, and then the software, the other things that we
mm,
know about how all this stuff fits together. And then the three main things that people ask me, which is what about sleep? How can I set my body clock? The other thing people ask me about is about mood, the worry about sad lamps and that sort of stuff. And the third, which comes up a lot, is to do with learning and memory and some of those other questions about sort of the short-term acute effects of light. So, and then there's a last bit, which is, as we were talking before we hit record, is how do you know what to buy? Where do you even start? So I put in a
mm.
little kind of shopping guide at the back, which is what do the
Oh,
numbers mean? Yeah, where if you're looking online, what numbers can
yes.
you need to look for, and what are the difficult questions to ask so that you can be sure that you're buying something which is going to work and not be a waste of money.
Fantastic. Yes, it's now speaking of blue light, I don't know if you're aware, Qantas has is getting a fleet of Dreamliners that are going to fly direct from London to Sydney and London to Melbourne. I think it's about a 21-hour flight,
Mm.
but direct. But you don't have to stop in Dubai or Singapore or somewhere or Bangkok and change planes, which is actually I'm fine. I think it's great. But they're using light to wake people up and help them get to sleep. I don't know if you're familiar with what Qantas is doing.
I am,
So,
and I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's
yeah.
fantastic. I was recently on because this book was just translated into Korean, which is a privilege to
Oh,
go and get the book out there. So I spent a very recent experience of being on a flight and seeing how an airline manages that. And on the way, essentially what this airline did was they served a meal, everyone got on, they served a meal, and then they switched the lights off. They made everybody close the window flaps. And because my understanding is that actually it's the cheapest and simplest way of keeping a very full aircraft quiet, because most people just put blankets over their heads and slept. And occasionally went up to get some water. But then about an hour and a half before we landed, they whacked all the lights on, did some announcements in several
yeah.
languages, and then sent some food down the aisles. And then, that was pretty much it. And so it seemed as though on the way out there, because of the timing, that was fine. But on the way back, it was completely inappropriate because we landed at sort of 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the UK, which meant that we'd had sort of a night, and then it was only really a couple of hours before you should be thinking about going to bed again. So they were, as many organizations, including schools,
Mm,
do, they organize the lighting and the timing to suit the operational rather than the human requirements of a setting. So I think that what Qantas is doing is absolutely fascinating, and I think we'll get them, particularly people who care about how they feel when they land. I think they will find themselves able to charge a premium or certainly fill the flights
mm.
more easily thanks to that approach.
Yes. The other thing that strikes me, because I've had that experience where they make you shut the window. I was flying London to Bangkok, and it's like I really want the window open. Not I just like the view, but also the cabin crew. I think they were London based, so they wanted to stay on their London time, and they didn't want daylight further on the flight when it was still nighttime in London to affect them. So they're running to keep the cabin crew circadian rhythm running on London time because they'll spend a night in Bangkok, then do all the same again the following day in reverse. So they're keeping their body clocks, but at the expense of the passengers' body clocks. Because, if you're flying, I'd like to adjust to Bangkok time, thank you very much, not stay on London time. And the same thing, hit me. I landed in the afternoon. I really want to actually get some sunlight. And so I sort of opened it and hunched a coat over it so that the light wasn't escaping, but I would like to see out. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah,
So,
and you are the passenger. But I think that question of the tension sometimes between the human needs and the sort of operational convenience is something that
mm,
comes up time and again. For example, we see in schools, if we allow, particularly for adolescents whose body clocks are shifting, I mean, they're in permanent
mm,
jet lag. If we
yes.
shift the start time, we shift their exam times to suit their body clocks, we see
Mm,
improved attendance, we see reduced
yeah,
accidents on the way to school, we see improved achievement, attainment. So, but it suits the parents who do the school run, or it suits the whole system to start at a time which is convenient for the teachers and the parents and not necessarily for the kids. So
mm,
I think airlines is a great example, and I do feel there is a gap somewhere in the market for a hotel group to create sort of circadian reset rooms. I'm starting to see that in high-end residential clients actually, where you can log in and say, if you've gone your way to if you're a business person and traveling, to find a way in your own home or in a hotel to say, please help me to stay on New York time, or I've got a series of important meetings with people in Australia. How can the lighting and other dimensions like temperature, acoustics, some of those other things can adjust to support
mm.
that multi-sensory signaling about the time of day?
That's a genius idea. And I have seen, like, I've got the jet lag goggles here, which are individual, but I have seen lamps as well that are the same blue-green color. Um, Speaking of schools, I we have early starting time. Here in Australia, I think it's about 9:15 in the morning, but I've heard in the US it's much earlier, and the state of Louisiana, some schools start at 7:15 a.m. which horrifies me. Those poor teenagers. You know, I think Louisiana doesn't rank well in terms of academic scores, and I reckon that's part of it because I do not want to study algebra at the best of times, but certainly not at 7:15 in the morning. I'm not going to find X.
No, and I think for kids who are sort of average and above, it's fine. But what was really interesting about the work that was done in New York, and then there was a school in London as well, which did a similar study, they found that the kids who struggled most got the best benefit. So if we want to level up and support kids who may struggle anyway, then
Hmm.
offering them that more sympathetic timing is going to give them the best chance of being the people that they could be. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Supporting. I have worked as a university lecturer, and I had one class at 8 a.m., um, which I was never late to, but it was a struggle for me. But I had a small. The students I had for the most part were really committed because I must have I've self-selected. I've selected for the early birds in
Yeah.
the cohort. But most of the time, my morning class started at 11:30,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. And that's,
and
I
that's
mean,
civilized.
yeah, I mean, I come from a sort of strong Protestant tradition. If it's not hard, it's not working. And actually, I don't think that needs to be the case. And what's also we see with this next generation of young people is that they are, if it doesn't suit them, they won't come or they
No,
won't, they'll
no,
be on their phones or so I think that
yeah,
people are much less biddable now. So I think we have to be
yes,
even more supportive and actually more accommodating and say, yes, that it doesn't have to be hard work. It can actually be,
no,
we can, we can make things so that they work for the people that they're supposed to be
yeah,
serving.
absolutely. Have them work for the in this case the students, but having that
Mm, mm.
work for them. So
We see something
that's
similar in,
sorry.
sorry, we're saying see something similar in residential healthcare where
Oh,
the shift patterns can define what time people are put to bed. So you can find that people are, if you're at the wrong end of the corridor, you're put into bed at about 5:30, and it's a long old time before 7:30 the next morning when someone comes to wake you up or sort of to come and get
oh,
you out of bed. And so those sorts of, and what we're seeing, there's a team I've been talking to who are looking at the preferences, the personal preferences of the residents, and using the lighting in the building to learn what time they would naturally wake up, what time they would naturally be up or down, and
hmm,
then using that data to tailor or essentially to schedule the wake up routine and the go to bed routine so that it ends up being a very gentle staggered thing. So Mrs. Jones likes to go to bed at 7:30. That's great. We'll pop her into bed. Mr.
yes,
Smith is still watching the telly at 10. Let's, let him do that, which means that he gets his
yeah,
night's sleep. And I mean, it reduces that sense of being institutionalized as well. So I think that you can,
hmm,
and what we're seeing is that adaptive lighting, so lighting which can tell where people are spending their time and what their activity levels are, we can use that kind of quiet eavesdropping system to learn how people prefer to live and then support them in that way of living rather than imposing an institutional framework on their
hmm,
timing.
hmm. I remember when my father some years ago was in hospital, and hospitals are well lit. And my father's one of those people who does not sleep if there's a single photon of light. I have a
Mm,
nephew who's the same, but cannot sleep, and I'm fine, but I think I didn't inherit that. But some people are really sensitive to light, and I
yes, they
think
really
the hospital and care settings can let those people down because there'll be some low level lighting. It's a
are.
hospital.
Well,
Um,
and yes, and yet, I mean, there's no reason not to have lighting which is responsive. So if somebody needs to get up, there's a gentle light
yeah,
when they need it. To have it on all the time is not only a waste of energy, but also a missed opportunity for people to get some proper sleep.
yeah, yeah. That's it. So, yes. Well, thank you for that. And are there any take home messages that you would give to our viewers?
I think the first is to sort of be a little bit of a scientist with yourself because everybody is uniquely different. So
Mm,
you will know what your preference for going to bed and waking up is. And all the studies on, natural chronotypes invite people to spend a couple of weeks simply listening to their own body, removing artificial stimulus like mobile phones and movies and those things, so that actually you can
yes.
tell for yourself when you feel a bit dopey, a little bit sleepy, and you can start to embrace that. So you start to know your own preferences. So that would be the first thing, is to kind of make friends with your body clock so that you
Mm,
know how you work. For example, if you know that you're uniquely sensitive to light in the evening or at night, then invest in an eye mask, which I have because when I travel, it's rare to be able to turn all those bits and bobs off in the bedroom. So the first
yes.
thing is to kind of be aware of that. I think the second is to one of the things we know is that the body clock, particularly if you're traveling, is it really loves a routine. And so, if you can, as much as possible, organize your life so that you have a wake up time and you get outside, even if it's standing on the doorstep wrapped up, because I know it's cold where you are, get outside for about half an hour in the morning. And that is going to bring your nighttime sleepiness earlier. So, that morning thing is like a doorstop on your day.
Mm,
And then if you are somebody who's going to need to stay up a bit later, then making sure you get some light around twilight will help you to stay awake just slightly longer if you've got a social occasion or something that you need to be awake for. So using
yes.
light at those two critical ends of the day as sort of markers or bookends to your body clock, I think are really important too. So I think those would be the main things I would say. And it's tempting to demonize blue light. I think actually blue light in the right place is absolutely fantastic.
Mm,
But if you can make sure that somewhere in your home you have some really soft, warm light so that in the evening you can reduce that physical stimulus, but also that emotional signal, because we're used to thinking that, I mean, your brain reads bright, cool light, particularly coming from above, as
mm.
it's daytime. I need to be doing stuff.
Yeah.
So if you can give your body all the information it needs to set itself in the right way, then things like mood, weight, metabolism, bone density, learning, memory, all those things will just quietly fall into place without you really having to work too hard.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Shelley James. Thank you for joining our podcast.
Thank you for having me.